Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are plunging into, well, a pretty complex topic. It's one that touches many lives but often stays hidden in silence. We're talking about the psychology of repeated exposure to pornography.
And importantly, we're coming at this from a clinical, empathetic angle. It's science-based, drawing on the material you've shared. Our goal here really isn't judgment or, moralizing. It's about understanding. How does this kind of media interact with our brains, our inner worlds, and what does that mean for well-being?
Exactly. It's like peeling back the layers to see the mechanics, the why behind it all, moving away from labels and more towards understanding, and maybe healing, if that's what you're looking for. So where should we start? Maybe with what the sources say happens in the brain.
Yeah, that's a good place. What the material keeps highlighting is the brain's reward system, dopamine specifically.
Dopamine often gets a bad rap, but it's essential.
Vitally essential. It's not bad in itself.
Yeah.
It drives motivation, learning, pleasure. It gets us moving towards things we anticipate as rewarding.
Okay. So how does this kind of content trigger that system?
Well, the sources explain that viewing pornography, especially stuff that's really novel or intense, it triggers these rapid, pretty potent surges of dopamine, right, in those reward pathways. It's basically designed to be highly stimulating, immediately gratifying.
So the brain gets this powerful, quick hit.
Exactly. And our brains are incredibly adaptable. That's neuroplasticity, right? So it learns really fast to link this content with that big reward signal. And over time, if you keep getting exposed to these high-intensity, fast dopamine spikes, it can literally start to rewire those pathways.
Rewire them, leading to what the sources call desensitization.
Yeah.
Or like a kind of numbing.
Precisely. The brain just gets used to that really high level of stimulation and starts expecting it. So this could mean needing more, maybe more extreme or novel content just to get the same feeling, the same activation.
And building up a tolerance?
Yeah, think of it like someone who eats super spicy food all the time. Eventually, milder flavors just taste bland.
Okay. So the brain adapts to the spicy reward, but the material suggests it goes beyond just needing more of the content itself. Like it affects how we respond to other rewards.
That's a really key point in the sources, yeah. If the brain gets wired to expect these intense, quick dopamine hits, it can become, well, less responsive, maybe even a bit bored by more subtle, sustained rewards.
Like what kind of things?
Things like, a deep conversation or the satisfaction you get from finishing a tricky project that takes time, or even just enjoying a quiet evening. Those things might feel less compelling, less rewarding compared to the immediate hit the brain has gotten used to seeking out.
So that feeling some people mention where everyday life feels a bit gray or flat, that could be linked to this brain adaptation.
It can definitely be a big factor. The sources suggest that overexposure to these really intense stimuli can lead to a more general feeling of numbness, not just around intimacy, but maybe a broader loss of enthusiasm for real-life connections, activities that offer those more nuanced, less intense rewards. The brain's just adapting to the environment it's in. And if that environment is full of high-intensity, easy-access digital stuff, it shifts.
That paints a really clear picture of the brain side of things.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift from that initial stimulation. How does this sometimes develop into something more compulsive? The material talks about a cycle.
Right. And it's important to say, not everyone who looks at porn develops a compulsive habit. Far from it. But the sources describe how for some people, especially if they're using it to cope with something else, it can turn into a cycle, kind of like other behavioral addictions.
What does that cycle look like, according to the material?
Often it starts with anticipation, maybe driven by triggers, stress, boredom, loneliness, some kind of emotional discomfort. Then there's the consumption, the viewing, which gives that temporary escape or relief. But that's often followed by a crash phase, feelings of guilt, shame, maybe fatigue. And then finally, the repeat phase. The discomfort from the crash can actually fuel the next craving, and the cycle starts all over again.
And the sources really stress that this cycle isn't just about weak willpower, is it? It seems rooted in something deeper.
Absolutely. The material emphasizes that this behavior is often just the surface. It's a way to deal with underlying discomfort or pain. It's like a temporary way to soothe or mask or just cope with unmet needs. The habit itself is more of a symptom, not the root problem.
That really reframes things. So what kinds of psychological effects does the material connect with this habit, especially when it becomes more compulsive?
Well, building on that brain adaptation we talked about, the sources discuss things like focus and motivation kind of eroding. If your brain is less sensitive to the normal, slower rewards of everyday tasks because it's tuned into those high-intensity hits, well, those tasks just feel less engaging.
Makes sense.
The material points to research linking frequent, compulsive use with a shorter attention span.
Hmm.
Makes it harder to concentrate on work or studies or personal projects. They just don't feel as immediately rewarding as the screen.
Yeah, if your brain's always looking for that quick burst, sticking with something long-term gets tougher internally. Beyond focus, the sources also talk about a significant emotional toll. Shame, self-worth issues.
Yeah, this is a really powerful and often painful part of it. For many people, doing something that clashes with their own values or feels out of control, it triggers intense shame. The sources describe how this can lead to really harsh self-judgments. I'm broken, I'm weak, something's wrong with me. Nobody could understand or love me if they knew.
Wow.
And this internal shame story, it thrives in secrecy. That secrecy leads to isolation, disconnection, which then just amps up the original stress or discomfort that might have fueled a habit in the first place. It really feeds itself.
It sounds like a vicious feedback loop. The shame drives the secrecy, which causes isolation, which makes you need the coping mechanism even more. And that disconnection isn't just internal, right? The sources highlight how it impacts actual relationships, difficulty with intimacy.
Yes, the material definitely notes that.
Yeah.
If you're relying on a solitary, often kind of performance-focused form of intimacy online, it can create barriers to authentic connection in real life. Real intimacy needs vulnerability, being emotionally present, navigating the messy bits, qualities that aren't really required when you're just interacting with content. It can make the emotional risk of true connection feel,
Yeah.
yeah, daunting or just unfamiliar.
So even if someone deeply wants genuine connection, the habit itself can kind of build walls against it.
It can. And the sources mention impacts on physical intimacy, too.
Hmm.
Sometimes real-life sex might feel less arousing or maybe even emotionally less safe. That's because the habit might have shifted the focus towards a more visual or transactional kind of experience, one that doesn't include the full spectrum of human connection and vulnerability.
We've covered the brain stuff, the psychological and emotional landscape. Now let's turn to what the material presents as a really crucial perspective shift, the trauma-informed lens. This feels like it gets closer to the why for many people.
Exactly. This is where the sources move beyond just simple behavioral explanations and look at the deeper function of the habit. The core idea here is that for a lot of individuals, especially those with histories of trauma or maybe difficult attachment experiences, this habit isn't about being bad or morally failing. It's about coping. It's about survival in a way.
Survival?
Yeah, it's how the system tries to regulate intense internal pain or stress or emotional overwhelm when other ways aren't available or feel safe. The behavior provides a temporary solution, even if it's ultimately unhelpful to deep underlying emotional needs that aren't being met.
Like a form of self-medication, maybe. Or emotional regulation when you don't have other tools. Can you give some examples from the sources?
Sure. The material talks about things like maybe emotional neglect in childhood, leading to this deep craving for validation or attention that the habit might seem to provide, at least superficially. Or maybe early experiences of shame or feeling powerless, driving a need for control, or escape into a fantasy world where things feel predictable. The sources also link it really strongly to loneliness and social isolation. The habit offers this fleeting, kind of simulated sense of connection, even while it makes the real-world isolation worse in the long run.
So the behavior isn't the core problem. It's more like a complex, sometimes damaging coping strategy the system figured out to manage deeper pain or unmet needs.
Precisely. It's fundamentally a response to suffering. The sources also connect this habit to dissociation. That feeling of disconnecting from your body, your emotions, or just the present moment.
Right. Dissociation is a common response to feeling overwhelmed or trauma.
Exactly. And the material points out that certain kinds of online content can really act as a portal for dissociation. It's like a predictable escape hatch from uncomfortable feelings or overwhelming internal states. It allows for this temporary split mind from body, presence from escape. It bypasses the vulnerability you need for real-world interaction.
And while that might offer a moment's relief, it actually deepens the very disconnection it's trying to soothe.
It does. And underlying all of this is the autonomic nervous system. Chronic stress, adversity, trauma. It can leave the nervous system dysregulated, kind of stuck in on fight or flight or stuck in off that freeze or collapse state.
Okay.
And both of those states make healthy emotional regulation incredibly hard. The sources explain that certain online content can offer a temporary fix. It might provide stimulation to pull someone out of collapse, or maybe offer distraction to briefly dampen down that hyperarousal of fight-flight.
So the dysregulated system finds a way to shift its state using this external thing, even if it doesn't actually build long-term regulation skills.
That's it, exactly.
Right.
It's a makeshift solution. But the real path to sustainable healing, as the sources really emphasize, isn't about finding better external things to manage internal states. It's about building internal nervous system regulation, finding safety inside.
Which brings us nicely to the section on realistic healing. The sources frame this very much not as achieving perfection overnight or just stopping, but as a practice, building a different relationship with yourself, your nervous system. What are some of the key approaches, the material details?
Well, it outlines several interconnected paths. One is around mindful media practices, setting up digital boundaries. And this isn't presented as like punitive, you must stop everything. It's more about cultivating conscious awareness, making deliberate choices about how you engage online.
Like noticing the urge, but maybe not immediately acting on it, pausing.
Exactly that. Developing that awareness muscle. Recognizing the triggers, understanding the emotions or the needs that are driving the urge before you automatically default to the habit. The sources suggest practical things too, like maybe using website blockers during times you know you're vulnerable, or consciously swapping mindless scrolling for activities that are actually restorative.
Like what?
Listening to music, doing something creative, meditation, journaling, whatever works for you. It's about mindfully shaping your digital space so it supports your well-being instead of just using it as an unregulated coping tool.
That sounds like shifting from fighting the urge to understanding the whole landscape around the urge and then creating conditions for different choices.
Precisely. And another huge piece is directly addressing nervous system regulation, fostering calm, that felt sense of safety within your body, rather than just trying to white-knuckle through urges with willpower, which honestly often just creates more tension.
How does the material suggest working with the nervous system directly?
The sources detail techniques aimed at signaling safety to the body. Simple things, like breath work focusing on slow, long exhales really activates the calming part of the nervous system, the parasympathetic. Or quick things like splashing cold water on your face can interrupt an anxiety loop or dissociation. Movement helps too. Walking, gentle stretching, even just consciously shaking to release trapped energy and help the body complete stress cycles. These help the nervous system find its balance again.
Those sound like really practical, powerful tools, working at the body level, making it easier to choose intentionally instead of just being driven by that dysregulation.
They're really foundational, and building on that internal regulation is the process of reconnecting, both with yourself and eventually with others. The material acknowledges that intimacy, emotional and physical, might feel really hard, especially if the habit has been the main source of simulated connection for a while.
So how does the material suggest bridging that gap? That sounds challenging.
It suggests starting small, maybe just quiet time focusing on connecting with your own body and emotions. Practices like body scans or mindful self-touch can help with that. When it comes to connecting with others, the emphasis is often on building platonic closeness first, focusing on creating relationships built on emotional safety, vulnerability, trust.
Emotional safety first.
Yeah, the material notes that emotional safety is often a prerequisite for feeling safe enough for physical intimacy, particularly if the habit is linked to past hurt. And crucially, the sources stress the incredible healing power of vulnerability. Sharing your story, your struggles, with trusted friends, family, a support group, even when it feels terrifying.
Given the shame we talked about earlier, that vulnerability step sounds huge, monumental.
It absolutely is. But the sources consistently point out that shame thrives in isolation and secrecy, naming things, with compassion, first to yourself, and then maybe with a safe other person. That's what starts to untangle the shame and build real, authentic connection.
Which connects beautifully to the idea of compassionate self-inquiry. It's not about fixing a broken part, but understanding yourself with kindness.
Exactly. Shifting that internal voice from harsh judgment and trying to control to gentle curiosity. Asking questions the sources suggest, like, what's my body telling me right now? What emotions are underneath this urge? What need is this habit trying to meet for me? What would be a genuinely kind response to myself right now, acknowledging this pain or discomfort? It's really about listening to your own pain with care, with presence, instead of just trying to force the behavior to stop through sheer will.
This feels like such a radically different approach than the usual narrative around habits like
It
these.
fundamentally is. It really honors the complexity, the roots in coping, and often trauma, and the deep human needs that are involved.
The material also gives some guidance on when seeking professional support might be important. What are some signs the sources mention?
Yeah, the material suggests reaching out if you feel persistently out of control with the habit, if it's negatively impacting your relationships, your work, maybe your finances, if you're dealing with pervasive shame or depression or anxiety tied to it, or just if you feel stuck and unable to make changes even though you're trying. It also reinforces that needing support isn't a sign of being flawed. It just means you're human and navigating something really complex.
And what kind of support does the material recommend looking for?
The sources suggest seeking professionals who are trained in approaches that really understand trauma and nervous system dysregulation, not just behavior change on the surface. Modalities like somatic experiencing, SE, trauma-informed CBT, internal family systems, IFS, attachment-focused therapy, these often get mentioned. These therapies tend to focus on healing that underlying pain, building internal safety, and repairing the capacity for connection, which in turn naturally lessens the need for the coping behavior.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together from our deep dive today, what are the main takeaways the sources want us to grasp?
Well, we've seen how repeated exposure can interact with the brain's reward system, potentially leading to desensitization, affecting focus, motivation. We've looked at the psychological tool, especially that erosion of self-worth driven by shame and the impact on connection. And crucially, the sources really underscored that for many, this habit acts as a complex coping mechanism. It's often about unmet needs, unresolved pain, or a nervous system that's struggling to regulate itself.
Right. And the path towards realistic healing isn't presented as perfection or just stopping cold turkey. It's more of a practice, rooted in mindful awareness, learning to regulate the nervous system to build that internal safety, rebuilding authentic connection with yourself and others, and really approaching the whole journey with deep compassion and curiosity.
Exactly. Healing, as the material puts it so well, is really about cultivating presence, building your capacity for connection, fostering a sense of safety inside, moment by moment. It's a practice of being with yourself and your experience, rather than just being focused on eliminating a behavior or hitting some external standard.
And understanding that underlying why behind a habit, especially when that why connects to these fundamental human needs for safety, connection, regulation, that's incredibly powerful, isn't it? It shifts everything from judgment to empathy for ourselves and maybe for others too.
It really transforms the whole narrative. It stops being about fault and starts being about fundamental human needs and the really complex ways we sometimes try to meet them.
So as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive into the source material, maybe consider what it reveals about those deeper human needs. That inherent drive we all have for connection, that fundamental need for safety, the constant seeking of regulation, and how complex habits, like the one we discussed, might be an attempt, however imperfect, to address those needs. What might your own curiosity about understanding any habit in your life reveal about the needs lying just beneath the surface?